The first thing I felt was the tremor through the soles of my boots. Not heard. Felt. A low, dry shiver came up through the station floor and into my knees, so faint I might have mistaken it for fatigue if the seismograph needle hadn't lifted at the same exact moment. The air in the control room tasted metallic, like pennies rubbed into dust, and the pressure in my ears rose and fell in tiny pulses that didn't match the wind outside. I was alone at the main console. Ingrid Voss had stepped into the generator room. Pavel Morozov was somewhere out by the western line of sensors. It was just me, the paper feed, the trembling pen, and that soundless pressure moving through the concrete. The trace jumped. 3 short spikes, 1 long, 3 short. I stared at it, not understanding at first why the shape bothered me. Then I checked the secondary monitor and felt my throat go cold. 10 seconds earlier, I'd had a pulse clip running on the diagnostics patch taped inside my wrist. I was calibrating latency drift between systems. The seismograph pattern matched my own heartbeat from 10 seconds before, not close, not approximate, exact enough that I could have laid one waveform over the other and mistaken them for the same source. I stopped breathing. The station floor jolted once beneath me, a sharp, upward knock like something below had struck the building with the flat of its hand. The needle hesitated. Then the pattern returned, slightly altered, not wrong, adjusted. The pauses were closer now, the long stroke fractionally shorter, like something had realized it was imitating me too literally and was trying to improve. Behind me, carved into the concrete wall, one of the rules sat at eye level. If the signal matches you, stop observing it. I didn't look away. The needle twitched again, and all I could think was, what had the person who carved those rules into concrete learned that they couldn't risk writing down any other way? That was 6 days into the job. I took the position because it was supposed to be simple. That still sounds ridiculous to me now, but at the time it made perfect sense. I was coming off a bad spring, too much adjunct work, too many grant applications, not enough certainty about what I was doing with a degree that had trained me to read the earth for signs of pressure and failure and motion. A summer contract at a remote seismic station in Alaska sounded like clean work. Instrument maintenance, event logging, calibration checks, long quiet nights with data streams that behaved according to known physics. Good pay because the station sat so far north that getting there involved a bush plane, a refueling stop on a strip of gravel, and an hour over country that looked less like land than the exposed bones of a continent. By the time I saw the Brooks Range from the air, I already understood what isolation actually meant. The mountains ran out beneath the wing in long black folds, still striped with old snow in the shadows, and everything between them looked flat only until the light shifted and showed me how the tundra puckered and dipped like skin over buried machinery. The pilot never said much. The engine droned. My ears ached with the descent. When we landed, the wind had teeth in it, even with the summer sun still hanging high. And there was that taste in the air right away, dry and metallic, the same taste I would come to associate with the station whenever the signal sharpened. The building itself squatted on a low rise of gravel and old poured concrete, part prefab utility shell, part bunker. Nothing about it looked abandoned, but nothing about it looked current either. The antenna mast leaned just enough to bother me. The instrument shed wore 3 different generations of patchwork repairs. The main station windows had been reinforced from the inside. Not boarded exactly. Layered, as if somebody had decided transparency was a luxury the place didn't need. Ingrid Voss met me outside before the propellers had finished winding down. She was taller than I expected, spare in the way people get when they spend years in cold climates and stop carrying any movement they don't need. No wasted gestures, no welcome speech. She shook my hand once, looked at my face like she was checking for signs of a problem she hadn't yet named, then took my duffel and said, "You're Alistair Boone." I said I was. She nodded toward the station. "Observe, don't interpret." I thought she was joking. Maybe a field maxim, the sort of thing senior staff repeated to keep junior analysts from getting too clever with thin data sets. I even smiled a little. Ingrid didn't. Inside the station smelled like warm dust, machine oil, and concrete that had held cold for decades. The low-frequency tremor reached me again once my boots hit the floor, more noticeable indoors where the walls caught it and returned it through the frame of the building. The main console took up half the control room. A bank of monitors sat above older analog equipment that should have been retired years earlier. Strip chart recorders still fed white paper across metal rollers. Somebody had maintained everything meticulously, but not according to any modernization plan I'd ever seen. It was as if the station had accepted new equipment only when absolutely necessary, and even then reluctantly. Then I saw the wall behind the console. The rules weren't posted, they weren't framed or printed or laminated. They had been cut straight into the concrete itself, not etched lightly, not scratched in a hurry. Carved. Deep enough that the grooves cast shadows in the angled afternoon light. Do not record patterns that repeat exactly. If the signal matches you, stop observing it. Never correct a reading that stabilizes on its own. If the station moves without a registered event, leave the instruments untouched. Do not stay outside when the ground feels hollow. I stood there with my bag still over one shoulder, reading them over and over while the room hummed around me. Each line conflicted with some part of my training. Of course you record repeating patterns. Of course you correct anomalous readings. If the station physically shifts, you inspect for hardware displacement. And as for the last two, they sounded less like operating procedure than the residue of somebody's private superstition. Ingrid followed my gaze. Those matter more than the binder. There was an operations manual on the desk, thick, official indexed. It covered weather interference, telemetry delays, maintenance cycles, emergency contact chains, and standard logging protocol for regional seismic activity. I skimmed enough to confirm what I expected. Nothing in it even hinted at the wall behind me. "Who wrote those?" I asked. "Nobody here now," Ingrid said. It was the kind of answer that closed a subject without technically resolving it. She took the manual from me, set it aside, and began walking me through the station. Generator room, storage, galley, bunk room, backup relay cabinet. She moved fast, spoke little, and never once gave me the sort of broad explanation an incoming summer hire should have gotten. Instead, she showed me procedures in fragments, each one precise and strangely bounded. How long to look at a live trace before checking another feed. How to log a probable instrument artifact without describing its shape in detail. How to leave a stabilized anomaly untouched until it broke on its own. It felt less like orientation than apprenticeship, like I was being taught the edges of a craft without the theory behind it. At the time, I told myself that was just Ingrid's personality. Some station chiefs protected routine like private property. Some resented rotating hires and assumed they'd be gone before real trust mattered. But when she showed me where I'd sleep, then turned to go, she paused in the doorway and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't read. "If something starts seeming familiar too quickly," she said, "wake me up." I almost asked what that meant. I didn't. There was a pressure building in my ears again, not painful, just enough to make my own voice feel far away. And the floor carried one of those tiny, silent vibrations through the bed frame. Looking back, that was the last moment I still believed the station was there to measure the Earth. The next morning I started on calibration. It should have been routine. Baseline drift, instrument sensitivity, transmission lag between the exterior geophone array and the internal station recorders. All the usual house cleaning that turns raw noise into useful data. The sky outside the narrow windows had that washed polar brightness that made it hard to judge time. My watch told me it was morning. My body wasn't convinced. The air inside the control room felt even drier than the day before, and every now and then a faint metallic tang settled on the back of my tongue so strongly that I checked the cabinet seals for battery leakage. The analog units behaved beautifully. That was the first surprise. They were old, but stable, more stable in some respects than the digital receivers patched into them. I ran the first sequence and watched the needle scratch out a mild set of local disturbances, wind rattle, thermal settling, something distant and glacial from far south in the range. Then a pattern threaded through it. Not a spike cluster, not harmonic interference, a sequence. 3 narrow deflections evenly spaced. Pause, 2 broader waves. Pause, 3 narrow again. It repeated exactly. I leaned closer, listening to the paper whisper across the rollers, hearing the faint servo whine from the adjacent unit. Exact repetition in seismic recording almost always meant contamination somewhere in the system. Crosstalk, electrical bleed, operator error. Natural earth motion doesn't like perfect loops. I reached automatically for the event log, and my eyes lifted to the wall behind the console. Do not record patterns that repeat exactly. The room felt suddenly smaller. I let go of the pen and checked the parallel channel. Same sequence. Then the exterior sensor line. Same again, but weaker. I opened the time alignment window and noticed something that made my scalp tighten. A faint echo of the sequence had appeared on one channel just before the actual signal arrived on the others. Not after. Not as reverberation. Before. The trace showed a soft ghost of the pattern like a pencil mark under an ink line, leading the real event by less than a second. I reran the buffer. Same thing. A pre-echo is the sort of phrase you say only when you're being careless because it isn't a thing in any useful physical sense. Noise can mimic anticipation if your sync is bad. Clocks drift. Software lies. But the station clocks were locked, and the analog paper didn't care what the software thought anyway. I put my fingers against the metal frame of the recorder and felt that low tremor under my skin, steady as a hidden motor. I should have logged it. Instead, I watched. The repeating sequence continued for almost a minute. Not a long time, objectively. Long enough, though, for the air pressure in the room to thicken and for my ears to pop twice without any change in altitude. Long enough for me to start expecting the next set before it arrived. Long enough that the pattern stopped being external data and began to feel like a rhythm I was participating in merely by anticipating it. Then it changed, only slightly. One of the narrow deflections came late. The second broad wave flattened. The pause shortened. I remember the exact sensation that went through me then, and it wasn't fear, not at first. It was professional embarrassment, the hot private feeling of realizing you've influenced a measurement just by the way you approached it, like fogging a lens you're trying to inspect. I stepped back from the console. The pattern held for 2 iterations in its altered form, then dissolved into background tremor so gradually I couldn't identify the frame where anomaly became noise. Ingrid appeared in the doorway like she'd been listening from somewhere. "Did you log it?" she asked. "No." "Good." She didn't ask what I'd seen. Didn't ask for amplitude or duration or probable source. She looked only at my empty event sheet, then at the strip of paper still feeding through the machine. I expected relief. What I saw on her face was something closer to confirmation. "What was it?" I asked. Ingrid came to the recorder and tore the paper strip cleanly at the roller. She folded the section with the anomaly inward so the trace no longer showed. "You'll get farther if you stop asking that first." That irritated me. I won't pretend otherwise. I had enough training to know when someone was withholding methodology behind mystique, and the fastest way to lose my patience was to imply that ignorance itself was professionalism. But the station floor gave one of those tiny corrective vibrations right then, a quick dry knock beneath both our feet, and Ingrid's eyes went to the wall. "Rule 1 isn't about paperwork," she said quietly. "It's about offering agreement." She left before I could ask what that meant. I thought about that pre-echo for the rest of the day. I still do. By the third day, I began to understand Ingrid's routine, and understanding it didn't make me feel better. She never watched a live feed continuously for more than a few seconds. Her eyes moved in patterns: left monitor, center recorder, right monitor, out the window, back to the panel lights, down to the manual sliders, anywhere but fixed on one trace for too long. At first, I thought she was just experienced enough to scan efficiently. Then I noticed she did the same thing even when one channel showed activity that would have drawn any trained analyst into focused review. She skimmed, sampled, and broke contact. She also refused to narrate anomalies in full. A normal station chief might say something like, "Low-amplitude regional event, north-northeast trend, possible ice fracture overlaying a deeper movement signature." Ingrid would say, "That one's trying to settle," or "Don't let that one become regular," or simply, "Leave it." The room stayed dry and stale with warm electronics. My ears kept catching those subtle shifts in pressure, the way a cabin pressure change feels a moment before you swallow. Sometimes the low tremor rose through the floor so clearly I could tell which part of the station frame was taking the load. Ingrid reacted to those changes before any visible data appeared. She'd put a hand flat against the console, wait, then step away from a monitor she'd been using and move to another. Once she reached past me and turned off a display entirely. "Why?" I asked. "Because it's easier to ignore what isn't lit." That afternoon I caught her doing something stranger. One of the internal instruments had registered a clean stabilization after a messy cluster of low-level disturbances. Under any ordinary protocol, that would have been the moment to annotate the correction, mark the transition, and verify the new baseline against the external array. Ingrid saw the stabilized line, took her hand off the keyboard, and leaned back. "Aren't you going to fix that?" I asked. She looked at me like I'd asked whether she intended to pet a bear. "Read the wall." "Never correct a reading that stabilizes on its own," I said. "That still doesn't explain why." "It does if you've been here long enough." Her tone wasn't superior. It was tired. Tired in a way I recognized from senior researchers who had repeated a warning so many times that they no longer expected language to carry the weight of it. She rubbed 2 fingers against the bridge of her nose and added, "Interpretation introduces noise." There it was again. Not observe carelessly, not stay objective. Interpretation introduces noise. As if understanding itself were a contaminant in the system. The phrase bothered me because it almost made sense. In seismology, interpretation isn't passive. You choose models. You privilege some data over others. You impose a framework that turns irregular motion into meaning. If the station dealt with some odd local resonance source, some geological feature that became unstable when measured too aggressively, then maybe Ingrid had built a whole private operating philosophy around minimizing intervention. Then she asked without looking at me, "Did it match you yet?" The control room went very still. I heard the soft motor tick from the chart recorder. The vents pushed out air that smelled like hot dust and old wiring. Somewhere below us, deep enough that it was more sensation than sound, the station frame carried a blunt pulse through the floor plates. "Match me how?" I said. Ingrid's expression didn't change. "You'll know." That was all. I spent the next several hours pretending I wasn't thinking about the question. I reviewed ordinary regional data, checked line integrity, cleaned contacts, cross-referenced maintenance notes. All the while, I was becoming aware of how much of Ingrid's behavior revolved around limiting contact rather than collecting information. She wasn't preventing bad procedure. She was adapting to something procedural language had never been designed to describe. By then, I had started glancing at the carved rules as if they might rearrange themselves when I wasn't paying attention. The cuts in the concrete were old, older than the current coat of paint on the opposite wall, older than some of the equipment racks bolted to the floor. The letters weren't decorative. They had been gouged there by somebody applying force over time. You don't carve into cured concrete because you're organized. You do it because paper can be lost and paint can be covered and screens can be turned off. That detail seemed minor then. I have thought about it every day since. On the fourth day, Pavel Morozov took me outside. He'd barely spoken to me before that. I knew him as the field technician, the one who handled the exterior geophone lines and made long trips out over the tundra in an aging tracked utility vehicle that sounded like it hated every gear change. He was older than Ingrid, broad through the shoulders, and carried himself with the slack patience of somebody who'd spent years working in cold open places where panic couldn't help you. Unlike Ingrid, who minimized every unnecessary word, Pavel seemed willing to talk. The problem was that what he said rarely clarified anything. The morning he took me out, the sky had gone high and colorless, a pale lid over the range. The wind skimmed the gravel around the station in thin, dry gusts, and each breath left that static metal taste on my tongue. He handed me a field pack, checked the receiver on my chest harness, and jerked his chin toward the utility vehicle. "We're walking part of it," he said. "You need to feel the difference." "The difference between what?" He shrugged into his jacket. "What the station says and what the ground says." That should have sounded poetic. In Pavel's mouth, it sounded like shop talk. We drove west first, then left the vehicle where the terrain became too broken for the suspension to manage cleanly. The tundra out there looked deceptively gentle. Low moss, gravel fans, stretches of thawed earth stitched with standing water and sparse grass. But underfoot the texture shifted constantly. Some patches felt densely packed, springy only at the surface. Others transmitted a strange emptiness through my boots, as if a solid crust covered a volume that wasn't solid at all. Not a sinkhole, not thaw rot, something subtler. A hollow feeling with no visible cavity to explain it. The first time I paused over one of those spots, Pavel's hand closed around my elbow immediately. "Don't stand still there," he said. His grip was iron dry through my sleeve. I moved on reflex. "Why?" He let go. "Because it notices vertical load faster if you give it time." I waited for the punchline. None came. We checked the first sensor post, then the second. The instruments themselves looked unremarkable: sealed housings, buried leads, weather shields, standard field hardware. What wasn't standard was the timing. At two separate stations, the exterior recorders showed low-amplitude events registering before the internal system at base acknowledged anything at all. Not a faster transmission route. These weren't relay delays. The local timestamp on the field unit had the event starting first. I showed Pavel the discrepancy. "That shouldn't happen." He squinted at the display, not because he needed to, but because I think he liked making silence do some of the work for him. Inside station listens wrong on purpose. On purpose. Mostly. The wind lifted, carrying grit across the surface of a nearby patch of bare earth with a hiss like dry paper. My ears tightened again. Pressure. No sound source I could point to. Just that sensation that the air itself had decided to lean. Pavel knelt beside the sensor housing and put his palm flat on the ground. I saw the gesture often enough later that I stopped finding it strange, but then it lodged under my skin. He wasn't checking warmth or moisture, he was waiting. The ground beneath him looked ordinary. Frost-heaved gravel, a seam of darker soil, nothing else. After a few seconds, he stood. We should keep moving. Does Ingrid know the external sensors are logging ahead of the station? He gave me a sidelong look. Ingrid knows what she needs. That answer annoyed me enough that I pushed. Then what am I supposed to know? Pavel adjusted the strap on his pack. Know when not to become the cleanest signal in the area. I didn't understand him, not really. But I remembered the second carved rule, and something cool moved down my back despite the insulated layers under my coat. We reached the westernmost line in the late artificial afternoon, though the sun still hung there stubbornly like it had forgotten how to set. Out beyond the final marker, the land folded toward the mountains in long dark ridges. I looked at the seismic map overlay on the handheld and noticed the station's local radius barely covered anything at all compared to the spread of the recent anomalies. Events I'd assumed were clustered near the building distributed themselves across distances too large to treat as local effects. The pattern wasn't centered on us. We were just sitting somewhere inside it. That was the first time scale pressed against me. On the way back, we crossed another patch of that hollow-feeling ground. This time I didn't stop. Pavel nodded once like I'd passed a quiz he hadn't told me I was taking. If you feel it go empty under you, he said, keep walking. Slow makes you legible. I turned that sentence over for hours. That night I began mapping the anomalies. I shouldn't have. Ingrid had told me to observe, not interpret, and by then I knew she meant it more seriously than any station protocol I had ever followed. But expertise doesn't vanish just because it becomes inconvenient. It searches for pattern, it assembles, it tests. That's what I had been trained to do, and until then every strange instruction at the station had only sharpened my need for a coherent model. So I worked after Ingrid went to sleep and while Pavel was still out checking a southern line. I pulled buffered records from the previous days, stripped out obvious environmental noise, and began comparing onset sequences across internal and external sensors. The control room sat in its usual cocoon of dry heat and quiet machinery. My ears kept filling and clearing. The floor carried a distant continuous tremor, a texture more than a motion, like the station rested on the throat of a machine too large to hear whole. At first the anomaly clusters looked merely repetitive. Then they started looking grammatical. I know how that sounds. I hated the thought when it came to me because it carried too much metaphor and not enough discipline. But the more I aligned the sequences spatially, the less they behaved like raw seismic events and the more they resembled structured transmissions passing through geological media. Not language, not in any human symbolic sense, but ordered, nested intervals, response windows, repeated forms modified by context. Certain wave groups appeared only after particular combinations of others. Some signals propagated across the array too consistently to be fractures or slips. Others arrived in broad, synchronized bands that ignored local substrate differences altogether, as if the bedrock were serving not as source but as conduit. I overlaid the station records with regional archives. What I found made the back of my neck go cold. The same families of patterns were there in older data buried inside what had been classified as unremarkable microseismic background, and they weren't confined to our immediate sector. They appeared in traces spanning vast portions of the Brooks Range. Faintly in some places, strongly in others, but coherent across distances too great for any single localized phenomenon to explain. Not a pocket, not a fault quirk, a system. The scale of it destabilized something in me more effectively than any direct threat could have. Horror likes something in front of you, something at the door, something in the room. This wasn't that. This was the realization that the mountain chain itself might be threaded with a process older and more deliberate than anything I had been sent there to measure. I checked propagation models 3 times. They failed 3 times for different reasons. The timing implied paths through rock that shouldn't transmit that cleanly. The recurrence intervals suggested memory. Worse, the spatial organization implied the signals were not simply moving through the subsurface. They were learning it. Sampling load, density, void, fracture, stress. Mapping by pressure. My mouth had gone so dry I could taste metal and paper at once. I stood up from the console and the room tilted for a moment, not from dizziness but from a hard change in ear pressure that made the station seem to deepen around me. One of the analog pens began scratching faster, not louder, faster. I looked over and saw a new pattern unfolding on the paper. It matched the map I was building, not the raw events, my grouping choices. The trace was reproducing the same interval clusters I had just decided belonged together, as if the act of sorting had changed what the station returned to me. I stared at it, every trained part of my mind trying to supply a technical explanation, while another part, older and simpler, prepared to get away from the desk. Then Ingrid's voice came from behind me. "Step away from that." I did. Instantly. She crossed the room, took one look at the recorder, and shut off the display I had been using for the spatial overlay. Not the recorder, the display. The pen kept moving over the paper in the dimness. "You started modeling it," she said. I didn't answer. My chest felt too tight. The floor tremor had risen just enough that I could feel it in my shins. Ingrid didn't sound angry. She sounded disappointed in a way that included fear. "Every time you decide what it's saying, you give it a cleaner surface to reflect against." I wanted to argue, but the pattern on the paper shifted again, reorganizing around a grouping I hadn't yet entered anywhere except in my own head. At the time, I assumed the danger was in the data. I know better now. After that, contamination stopped being theoretical. The first clear incident happened while I was eating. I was alone in the galley, if you can call a narrow room with a bolted table and a humming freezer a galley, going through instant soup that tasted like hot salt and cardboard. My spoon hit the side of the bowl 3 times without thought, a nervous habit. A second later, through the wall, I heard the nearest chart recorder make 3 quick ticks. I set the spoon down. The recorder made 1 longer drag across the paper. Then 3 quick ticks, the same pattern from the cold open. My pulse climbed so fast I felt it in my gums. I went to the control room and looked at the strip. The trace wasn't duplicating the spoon taps. It was duplicating the rhythm in my wrist that had preceded them, the tension sequence that made the movement likely before I consciously noticed doing it. Not perfectly. Close enough. I backed away and kept backing away until my shoulders hit the doorframe. From then on, it escalated by degrees that would have been easy to rationalize separately. When I paused in front of a monitor and unconsciously shifted my weight from left foot to right, a low oscillation emerged in the internal feed on the same interval. When I woke from a shallow sleep with my breathing trapped in that half-panicked pattern you get in unfamiliar rooms, the pressure in my ears rose and fell with it. Once, while reviewing a minor anomaly cluster, I started anticipating the next deflection before it arrived. The pen drew the anticipated shape, then corrected itself when my expectation changed. If the signal matches you, stop observing it. I started obeying that rule absolutely. The moment I recognized my own rhythms, heartbeat, breathing, tapping, pacing, even the private timing of how long I hesitated before touching a control, I broke visual contact. I stepped away from the live feed. I left the room if I had to. Ingrid watched all this without surprise. If anything, she seemed relieved that I had finally stopped needing the logic explained before I accepted the procedure. "It's not just motion," she said one night while we sat in the control room under the thin fluorescent buzz. The air had that dry, static taste again, and the floor under my chair carried a faint, grainy tremor like distant engines turning over under tons of rock. It's cadence, expectation, repetition, anything that becomes reliable. So it is matching me. It is refining you. That was worse. I must have shown it because Ingrid looked toward the dark window over the Western instruments and added, "Don't flatter yourself. It isn't interested in you as a person." "What is it interested in then?" She rubbed her thumb along the edge of a blank log sheet. "Us as measurable structure." I didn't sleep much after that conversation. Every unconscious process in my body started to feel exposed. I tried controlling my breathing, then stopped when I realized deliberate control only produced another pattern. I avoided drumming my fingers. I changed the order of my tasks. I began entering the control room from different doors when possible, pausing at irregular intervals in the hall so my footsteps wouldn't become predictable. Rationally, I knew that sounded ridiculous. Functionally, it helped. The traces lost some of their immediate resemblance when I varied myself enough. That was the lesson hidden inside the rules. They weren't mystical warnings. They were adaptations, built the way field knowledge is built in bad environments, one surviving correction at a time. Don't record exact repetition because exact repetition is agreement. Don't watch something that matches you, because observation sharpens reciprocity. Don't correct self-stabilized readings because spontaneous stabilization means the system has chosen a form, and touching it gives it one more response to calibrate against. I had come to the station thinking expertise meant precision. The job was teaching me the opposite. Precision was exposure. It was around then that Ingrid finally told me what the station was actually for. She did it at 2:30 in the morning when the light outside had dimmed only enough to turn the windows into dull mirrors and the building seemed suspended between day and night. A dry electrical smell hung in the control room. The pressure in my ears had been building for an hour. One of the deeper channels had stabilized into a broad, coherent hum that made the coffee in my mug vibrate in rings too fine to see unless I leaned close. Ingrid stood at the main console with the event reports open in front of her. Not the live data, the outgoing reports. "Read this," she said. She handed me a week of submitted summaries. They were wrong, not randomly wrong, deliberately, methodically, subtly wrong. Magnitudes softened. Event origins shifted. Timing offsets introduced where none existed. Pattern families broken apart and labeled as unrelated local disturbances. Coherent wave groups redistributed across separate entries so they looked messy and incidental instead of structured. It wasn't sloppiness. It was sabotage carried out by someone who understood exactly how much truth could be removed from a data stream before it stopped being useful to anyone downstream. I looked up at her. "You falsified all of this?" "Yes." "Why are you still employed?" A ghost of a smile crossed her face and vanished. "Because this station isn't here to monitor earthquakes." For a few seconds, I only heard the soft scratch of paper through rollers and the distant dry tremor rising through the floor. Then she tapped one of the outgoing forms with a blunt fingernail. "This place is a feedback instrument. Has been for longer than I've worked here, maybe longer than anybody's records are honest about. The official purpose gives cover. The real job is interference." I didn't speak. I could feel my pulse in my neck, and I hated that I could feel it. Ingrid went on. "What's under the range uses pressure the way we use light or language. It sends structured signals through bedrock. Not quakes. Not as we define them. Probes, comparisons, corrections, maybe records, maybe all of those at once. If we interpret them cleanly, if we preserve their structure accurately, We help it refine whatever model it's building. Of the mountains, of everything available to be modeled from inside the mountains. The room suddenly felt colder, though the air coming off the equipment was warm. And the reports? We send back noise, misreadings, broken patterns, enough contradiction to keep the loop unstable. I thought of the first carved rule, offering agreement. Who carved those into the wall? I asked. Ingrid's eyes moved to the concrete behind me. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. They were here when I arrived, she said. Older staff left notes once. Paper, whiteboards, terminals. They never stayed useful. Some got corrected. Some stopped meaning what they meant, concrete holds. That answer tightened something deep in my gut. Not because it solved the question, because it didn't. Whoever had been here before had learned enough to distrust ordinary writing itself. Pavel knows all this? Ingrid let out a breath through her nose. Pavel knows too much and in the wrong direction. That was the first time she sounded openly wary of him. What does that mean? It means I've spent years trying to confuse the system, and Pavel keeps thinking he can negotiate with it. The word sat between us like a smell. Bargain, I said. If you prefer. She closed the reports. He's been here longer than I have, long enough to believe there's a version of being legible that doesn't cost him. There was a soft ticking from the nearest recorder, not from the signal. From the cooling metal frame as the building shifted almost imperceptibly around us. Can there be? I asked. Ingrid didn't answer. She didn't have to. That was the moment everything that had happened before rearranged itself. The wall rules, her scanning habits, the external sensors leading the internal ones, the matching rhythms. The way the station seemed less like a laboratory than a contested boundary. It wasn't built to observe an ancient system. It was built to stand in the path of one and lie. Once I knew that, the rest came fast. The alignment event began the next day just before what passed for evening. I knew it had started before I saw the instruments because the pressure in my ears dropped so suddenly that I staggered, swallowing hard against a burst of pain. Every loose object in the galley gave a tiny synchronized rattle. The metallic taste in the air deepened until it felt like breathing through powdered batteries. Then the floor moved under my boots in a smooth, deliberate wave. Not a quake jolt, not random vibration, but a measured rising motion that traveled from the western footings to the eastern wall like a hand passing under the station. I ran to the control room. Every channel was alive, not chaotic, alive. Lines that should have been independent had locked into coherence. The internal recorders, the external array, even the degraded old analog units Ingrid trusted most, all displayed the same broad, structured event translated through different sensitivities. The pattern rolled across the paper in interlocking bands, pauses nested inside pauses, wave groups opening and closing with the precision of something assembled rather than erupted. The station itself vibrated in sync. I could feel the signal in the console edge under my hands, in the screws humming against their mounts, in the cavity of my chest where certain frequencies turn your body into a passive instrument. Ingrid was already at the secondary panel, disabling displays, rerouting outputs, severing clean correlations wherever she could. "Don't chase it," she said. "I wasn't going to." "Good. Because this is what it wants." The walls answered her with a deeper tremor. Dust shivered loose from a cable housing. Outside the window, the gravel around the station gave a subtle collective shift. Not collapsing, not cracking, just settling by increments into a geometry my eyes couldn't quite hold. I looked at the western external feed and felt a terrible clarity arrive all at once. The event wasn't passing the station. It was aligning it, bringing the building, the footings, the instrument housings, the cable runs, every rigid-shaped object we've driven into that ground, into resonance with the larger pattern below. The station wasn't merely inside the system's field, it was being invited into the structure. On the Western camera, Pavel Morozov walked into frame. He should have been coming in. Instead, he moved away from the access track and out onto a stretch of tundra I recognized immediately from the day he'd taken me outside. Hollow ground, the patch where he had warned me not to stand still. The image shook with low-frequency interference, but I could see enough. The surface beneath him quivered in fine concentric ripples, not visible displacement so much as a change in texture, as if the earth had become a skin stretched over controlled motion. "Pavel," Ingrid said, and there was real fear in her voice now. He stopped in the center of it, completely still. The pattern on the western feed tightened. Not at the station. Around him, the ground stabilized under his boots with impossible courtesy, the rippling surface smoothing into firmness while the surrounding terrain continued its minute vibrating shift. For one unreal second, it looked as though the land had recognized his shape and made room for it. Pavel lifted his head toward the station camera, then he nodded, just once. A small private acknowledgement, as if someone had answered an offer the rest of us weren't supposed to hear. He walked out of frame. I started for the door. Ingrid caught my sleeve so hard the fabric bit into my wrist. "No. He'll get buried out there." "Or he won't," she said. "Either way, you do not follow him when it's arranging itself." The building gave another synchronized shudder. One of the recorders stuttered, then recovered into an even cleaner trace. I remembered the fourth carved rule. If the station moves without a registered event, leave the instruments untouched. But this was a registered event. That was the problem. Too registered, too coherent. Like the system had finally decided to stop disguising itself as noise. For the next several minutes, maybe longer, time got unreliable. Ingrid and I moved through procedures that had never appeared in the official manual. Breaking channel sync, introducing offset errors, scrambling the cleanest output paths, anything that might keep the station from becoming a faithful mirror. Several times the structure groaned in long, controlled pulses that I felt in my teeth. The windows buzzed, the pressure in my ears cycled with uncanny regularity. Each time one of us established a stable read, the signal used it. Each time we broke the pattern deliberately, the coherence loosened a little. That was the first practical proof I had ever seen that falsehood could function as a survival tool. By the time the event ebbed, the control room looked unchanged, which made the whole thing worse. No shattered glass, no dramatic damage, just a thin layer of new dust on one shelf, a cracked ceramic mug, a few loosened bolts in the secondary rack, and paper strips curled across the floor like discarded skins. Outside, the tundra sat under the pale light as if nothing had happened. Pavel did not return that night. He came back the next morning just before dawn, if dawn means anything that far north in summer. His clothes were clean. His boots had no mud on them. His expression was calm to the point of absence. He walked past me into the station carrying a field case I was certain he hadn't taken with him the day before. When I asked where he'd been, he looked at me for a beat too long, then said, "Outside." Nothing about him was visibly wrong. That disturbed me more than if he'd come back injured. Ingrid didn't argue with him, didn't demand explanation. She watched him the way you watch a cable under strain, not touching it, just calculating what happens if it parts. Pavel spent the day servicing instruments with unusual care, humming under his breath in irregular little phrases that never resolved into a tune. Once I saw him standing by the western window with his hand flat against the glass, eyes half closed as if listening through the pain. His fate, if you can call it that, never resolved in any clean way. He remained, he worked. He smiled more after that, faintly, like a man who had finally received reassurance he'd been waiting years to hear. I still don't know whether the ground accommodated him because he'd bargained successfully, or because he'd already become something easier to place. After the alignment event, I stopped trying to understand in the old sense. That doesn't mean I stopped thinking, it means I accepted that objective accuracy was no longer the ethical goal. In any normal scientific setting, deliberate misreading would be malpractice. There it was hygiene. Ingrid taught me the practical methods: offset amplitudes without creating obvious fraud, break repeating families into unrelated entries, delay a clean onset by just enough to destroy precise reciprocity. When a signal stabilized elegantly on its own, leave it alone. When it started to reflect cadence back at us, withdraw. If two channels agreed too perfectly, make one of them uncertain. Not chaos, not random sabotage, structured confusion. Enough to keep the feedback loop from locking. Once I learned to do it, I understood why the station still relied on paper and analog instruments. Digital systems crave fidelity, they preserve too cleanly. The older machines introduced friction, drift, texture. Human handling added more. Our job was to remain an abrasive surface inside a process that wanted polish. The maximum revelation didn't come as a vision or a final monstrous sight. It came as a model I could no longer avoid, assembled from every close call, every rule, every false report, every moment the station or the ground or the traces had reacted to being observed. What's under the Brooks range is not an organism in any sense that helps. Not a machine either, though sometimes that metaphor gets near the edge of it. It is a resonance system embedded in the deep structure of the earth, older than the tectonic story we tell ourselves because our story starts with motion. We can measure and not with the prior condition that taught matter how to hold a pattern. It uses pressure waves the way other systems use memory. It sends structured signals through bedrock to map load, void, fracture, density, stress, and persistence across spans of time so large our categories flatten under them. Mountains, faults, ice, sediment, infrastructure, bodies, habits, repeating rhythms, all of it becomes available if it can be sampled through response. That was what the heartbeat incident was. Not imitation for its own sake. Calibration. A test of whether a human observer could be integrated as another stable, measurable structure inside the larger map. That was what the pre-echo had been too. Not prediction exactly, a sign that the system was not only recording but generating candidate forms ahead of confirmation, comparing expectation to response. And the station's true function was suddenly obvious in a way so complete it made me feel physically ill. We weren't there to decipher messages. We were there to poison legibility, to keep the system from refining its model of human observers and the built environment around the station into something stable enough to use. Because if it could map us accurately, it could place us. Maybe it already had in other times, in other buried systems of load and correction far beyond our station. I don't know. That's part of the scale that still wakes me up. The signals we intercepted were too widespread, too old in the archived background, too consistent across distance for our outpost to be anything but a pinprick on the edge of a vast process. The station was a local interruption, not a solution. And there was one more truth hidden inside it, the one that cost me whatever remained of my old professional certainty. Full understanding would make me useful to it. The cleaner my model became, the more predictable my attention would be. The more predictable my attention, the easier I would be to sample, mirror, and fit into the system it was building through stone. So I accepted a kind of deliberate ignorance, not stupidity, discipline. I know enough to interfere. I refuse to know enough to become elegant. That is still my job. I stayed. You might think survival would mean leaving, taking the next bush plane south, writing a report no one would believe, finding another line of work where the ground under the building behaved like ground. I considered it. Ingrid even gave me the option once a week after the alignment event, while we were swapping a worn recorder belt in the dry, warm hum of the equipment room. She said, "If you're going, go before it starts feeling normal." I knew what she meant. The station had already begun rewriting my thresholds. The metallic taste no longer alarmed me on its own. I could tell harmless tremor from dangerous coherence through my boots before I reached the control room. I had begun varying my routines without thinking. I checked live traces indirectly first, reflections in dark screens, paper movement at the roller edge, never full attention at once. Knowledge had become habit. I asked Ingrid if leaving would matter. She took too long to answer. "Maybe," she said. That wasn't enough. Pavel is still here too, though I avoid being alone outside with him now. Sometimes he goes to the western line and stands where the ground once hollowed under my steps. Sometimes he comes back with that distant almost smile and spends an hour adjusting sensor housings that don't require adjustment. Once I found one of the exterior units repositioned by a fraction that made no practical maintenance sense, but brought it into cleaner geometric relation with 3 others. When I moved it back, the station floor gave a single sharp corrective knock under my boots. I left it alone after that. The official reports continue. Weather noise, glacial chatter, minor regional events, all filed with the right codes and the wrong truths. Every shift I misread what needs misreading. Every day I introduce just enough error to keep the cleanest patterns from becoming useful. Ingrid says the goal isn't victory, it's delay, friction, survival measured in continued ambiguity. Sometimes the system presses harder. A broad pattern will arrive across all channels and the room will fill with that dry metallic tang until my tongue feels coated in static. My ears will tighten, the floor will hum with a cadence that nearly matches my walking pace. On those days, I work slowly and badly on purpose. I change hands when I write. I alter the order of my checks. I let one recorder run longer than another. I become inconsistent with care. People ask, when they ask anything at all, whether the station gets lonely. That's the wrong question. Loneliness implies empty surroundings. Nothing about this place is empty. The mountains are full. The bedrock is busy. The ground outside can feel hollow not because there is nothing beneath it, but because something below is making room for a pattern. I used to think the carved rules were a relic of panic. I don't anymore. They are the most precise document in the building because they were written by someone who had already learned what had to be shortened to remain true. Do not record patterns that repeat exactly. If the signal matches you, stop observing it. Never correct a reading that stabilizes on its own. If the station moves without a registered event, leave the instruments untouched. Do not stay outside when the ground feels hollow. I follow them. I add nothing. I carve nothing else. That feels important. Maybe the person who cut those lines into the wall learned the same thing Ingrid taught me, that some information becomes more dangerous as it becomes more complete. Maybe they discovered there are facts you can survive only in the form of procedure. Maybe they understood that ordinary language wants coherence, and coherence is exactly what the system below rewards. I still monitor the station. I still sleep in the bunk room when the pressure in my ears lets me. I still wake sometimes to the sensation that the building has shifted by a hair without any registered event. And on those nights I lie still in the dark and listen to the low tremor move through the frame until it passes. In the mornings I drink stale coffee, taste the metal in the air, and falsify whatever the mountain sends me. I can do the job well now. That's what frightens me, because competence here doesn't look like mastery. It looks like learning how to remain partially unavailable. It looks like refusing neat conclusions. It looks like seeing a pattern complete itself and choosing not to be the person who confirms it. I survive by giving the wrong answers with increasing skill. And still, every so often I catch something in the traces that feels too close to intention. A rhythm that anticipates my pause. A pressure change that arrives before I notice holding my breath. A sequence on the paper that seems to lean toward the interpretation I haven't yet allowed myself to finish. Those are the moments I think about Loop 3, though I didn't have a name for it at the start. The question under all the others, not how old the system is, though I suspect the answer would break any timeline I trust. Not who carved the wall, though I think about their hands often. The real question is whether my interference means anything outside human scale. Whether I'm preventing integration or merely taking part in a longer process by playing the obstructive element assigned to me. In other words, whether I'm studying it less than it's studying the shape of my resistance. I haven't solved that. Maybe it can't be solved from inside the station. Maybe the inability to solve it is the only thing keeping me useful to myself. So I keep working. Before each shift, I stand in the control room for a moment with the monitors dimmed and the paper feeds still. I feel for the tremor through my boots. I taste the dry metal in the air. I wait for the pressure in my ears to settle into whatever shape the day is taking. Then I look at the traces, but not for long. And now, before I write down any false reading, I always wait to see whether the line has already started forming it for me.